Surprise. So as many of you may know, we're also on Zoom this evening. So this is one of our hybrid events, in-person attendees and Zoom attendees. So welcome. Good evening, everyone here in the room and in the Zoom universe. Welcome to the Book Club of California's live and online presentation for Monday, September 12th, 2022. Tonight, it's all about book plates. Surprise for those of you who are in the room who've been enjoying the exhibition. We do have our exhibition opening for the tribute to George Steiner, an international book plate competition. And we'll have remarks by James Keenan, director of the American Society of Bookplate Collectors and Designers. And then we'll have a talk titled Bookplate Collecting in America by William E. Butler, bibliophile, editor, and exlibrist. Both of these events are co-presented and co-hosted by the American Society of Bookplate Collectors and Designers. Now, my name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the executive director for the Book Club of California. And again, it's my pleasure to welcome you all here. For those of you who might be new to us, and this is your first time here joining us on Zoom or here in the rooms, the Book Club of California is a nonprofit, member and donor supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with a particular focus on the literature and history of California and the West. The book club publishes finely made limited edition books, a scholarly journal, and keepsakes. And we host a year-round series of exhibitions and talks like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, and much, much more. So if you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. If you're not a member, or if your membership has lapsed, I strongly encourage you to go to bccbooks.org to join or renew your membership. We can't really do the work that we do without the support of our members, so please join us if you can. And now for tonight's program. I'm going to ask James Keenan to take the podium for some remarks about the exhibition and introduce our speakers. But first, in terms of some logistics, if you're joining us via Zoom and you have questions or comments for our presenters, please use the chat and the Q&A function in Zoom. We should have time at the end of the hour to take some questions, and we'll curate those questions from the Zoom universe using the chat and the Q&A. We'll also take questions from the audience here at the book club. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce James Keenan, director of the American Society of Bookplate Collectors and Designers. It's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you. And thanks for coming to our exhibition and talk tonight. Every year we co-sponsor with the Victoria University in Wellington, New Zealand, a bookplate design competition. This was the first one, and we chose George Steiner, who was alive at the time, but unfortunately, he didn't get to see the book plates because he passed on a couple of months before our deadline, which is a pity. But his children actually made the final decisions on the top three winners, which you see on the top shelf of the case over there. And I think that I will now introduce Gianna Alexpoulou, who is the grand prize winner of our contest. And she's all the way from Athens, Greece.
Thank you very much. My name is Gianna Alexopoulou, is Yana in Greek. I came here from Greece, and you all saw my exlibris. I hope you like it. It's wonderful and hopeful, our coming back in action after hard under many perspectives for all of us, 2020, 2021, and this year too. Back to exhibitions excuse me, that have been or are going to be launched And this exciting news about the first prize makes me feel very happy and honored and thankful. I would like to congratulate and thank everyone individually for holding this competition. I'm very grateful to the Steiner family, not only because they picked my work first, but also because they realized that both the composition and the general aesthetic addressed and represented their father. I was inspired to create my exlibrist thinking about how such a distinguished person feels with so many life experiences and knowledge. What emotion is deeply engraved and all these years in his heart, and the emotion that was revealed to me was this exlibrist you've seen. The central role is played by the knowledge that is not sterile, it's the knowledge of the brilliant Athena, who has studied so many times and since he was a child in Homer and not only there. Thus, I represent its symbol, the owl of the clever sage Athena, who carries in her body his origin, accompanied him since his very first wanderings about the magical reading of Homer. I almost see him playing in the magical world we all created as children, with Athena turning a blind eye to him, predicting his evolution. Woodcut gives the roundness of the old books illustrations, and the whole composition successively opens upwards in a serene Aegean and a clear blue sky with open horizon for his own last voyage. I would like to emphasize the fact that there were too many wonderful works, so I congratulate all of them. Thank you very much. Thank you. Back to
Okay.
James Tina. Thank you.
Now I'd like to introduce our speaker, William E. Butler. He's going to present a talk on bookplate collecting in America.
Thank you, James. It's a pleasure to be present once again at this distinguished club. This is my first time in person, but I did give a lecture earlier this year on Catherine the Great and her celebrated nakaz. It's a lot more fun, I can tell you, coming in person to San Francisco than sitting in southern Pennsylvania on a Zoom camera. I want to make a couple of remarks by way of felicitation at the beginning. It happens purely by coincidence, as far as I know, that I'm in effect opening the formal part of this 39th Congress of the International Federation of Exlibrist Societies, which is being held this year in the United States for the first time since the year 2000, when the same individual, James Keenan, organized the Congress of that year. We have them every 2 years in Boston, Massachusetts. So he's covered both sides of the country extremely effectively. This is the 39th Congress, and I'll have more to say about the International Federation of Exlibrist Societies. We know it as FISAE, F-I-S-A-E in capital letters, because that's the acronym in the French language, and both English and French are official languages of FISAE. I'm going to make general remarks initially, then I'm going to speak briefly about organized collecting of exlibris, commissioning a bookplate, forming a collection of bookplates, joining a bookplate society, and concluding with some remarks on forming a library of bookplate literature. I am working partly with a prepared text, which I'll explain to you later at the end, but I'll extemporize from time to time from it. This year, 2022, is the 100th anniversary of the American Society of Bookplate Collectors and Designers. That's a mouthful. Even the acronym AS and BC and D is a mouthful. So I'll just call it the American Society from henceforth. But it's 100 years, and James was thinking 6 years ahead when he offered to host the Congress in the year 2016 at our Congress in Vologda, Russian Federation. That invitation was accepted, as were invitations for 2018 in Prague, 2020 in England, which could not happen for reasons well known to all of us. What is the history of organized bookplate collecting? We're not certain when people began to collect book plates, we are quite certain when societies were formed to assemble individuals together who were interested in book plate collecting. We can date in the United States the formation of book plate collections probably at least to the 1840s. The English go back before that. They've identified a lady who had a collection probably in the 1820s or 30s. The Germans have topped us all. They have found a scrapbook dating to 1717, which contains book plates in it together with other small engravings. Now, whether that can be considered a book plate collection or not is discussable, but for historical reasons, that's back as early as we can go with all of this. One of the individuals whose collection we can date with certainty in this country was a man named James Eddy Moran, M-A-U-R-A-N, who passed away in 1888 and who we know had a collection of at least 1,500 foreign and American book plates. We assume that it was probably one of the largest in this country at the time, and it was later purchased by a man named Mr. Dears, D-E-A-R-S, who incorporated it into his collection. We know that students of heraldry were well aware of bookplate designs as a source for the earliest days because they used heraldic devices to identify the owners. So you had to know how to read a coat of arms. There might be no name on it, but the heraldic symbolism should be able to tell you, if you knew heraldry well, who was the owner of the bookplate. So there were American periodical publications like the Heraldic Journal in Boston in the 1860s, just after the Civil War, which made reference to engravers of bookplates in the United States. And there was a reference to a so-called Harris collection of bookplates. There was a textbook on heraldry in this country, can you imagine, called The Elements of Heraldry, that illustrated bookplates and referred to American bookplate designers. There was a collector named Richard Lichtenstein who drew upon his own holdings of bookplates to produce 10 articles on American bookplates in American and English antiquarian, bookplate, and heraldic journals, including a journal called Curio. The preeminent authority of that period on American bookplates, if you begin to collect, you'll want to acquire his book, which is easy to obtain, was a man named Charles Dexter Allen, who wrote a book called American Bookplates in the 1890s. And that is a standard reference manual for all of us for that period. There's, of course, always the issue of terminology in these matters. We speak about the exlibrist, and that's probably the most general term that you can use for a mark of provenance, a mark of ownership of a book or a manuscript. So the word bookplate is a subgenre of exlibris. Bookplate is usually paper, but it could be other substances, something that's pasted into the book at the time, and is normally what most people collect when they speak about exlibris collecting. So the terms overlap, but they're not synonyms, and most people will distinguish them one from the other if there is reason to do so. Of course, bookplate collecting has come to the forefront again because of the revived interest in book history that we're all familiar with in the last 2 or 3 decades or so. So provenance marks, and that's exactly what exlibris are absolutely crucial, central to the study of book history and ownership relations. Usually we think that provenance marks are intended to designate ownership. It's possible they're intended to designate something else. When that question arises, we collectors have vigorous debates about whether it belongs in the collection or whether it doesn't. Heraldic or armorial designs have been cut out of books and pasted in as exlibris when they're not, and they don't really reflect who's the proper owner of the book. There's been a vigorous debate for more than a century about whether Catherine the Great had her own bookplate or not. Well, there were candidates offered for that possibility in the early 20th century, and so far they have been each discredited. But there was one that came to light in the collection of Yale University Library in the late 1990s, was illustrated in a Finnish journal, attracted the attention of Russian collectors, was accepted by some, as being a probable legitimate example of her heraldic bookplate. I was one of those who went to Yale to look at it, and it became clear that it was not. It was cut out of something else. It came to Yale through an American collector, a lady in Ohio who'd probably acquired it around 1950 or thereabouts, and had probably been sold it as by a dealer as a legitimate exlibrist. So there's a literature back and forth on issues such as this. It makes for lively discussion and debate, and it goes, of course, to the heart of book history, because had it been legitimate, then of course we would be looking for other examples of it in what survives of Catherine's library, and most of it does survive, but no such bookplate has been found. The materials that can be used for bookplate purposes are almost infinite in character. Paper, yes. Birch bark is known. Plastic, metal, leather, wood. Others, it's whatever somebody intends to design or use for this purpose, indicates ownership, and is actually pasted in the book or superimposed on the binding as in the form of a super libros. So provenance marks go back early into human history. And if by that we mean evidence of ownership or affiliation, then how far back we can't determine for certain, but possibly as far back as anything preceding the Codex in its modern form can be proved to exist or not. But mostly what we're talking about in the world of the bookplates is a paper object that dates from as early as the mid 15th century. We have early candidates for that. My necktie is the necktie of the Bookplate Society in England. The angel on it is taken from the Berkheimer bookplate, which contains that design. This goes back to the 1980s, long out of print, out of stock, but it was a serious discussion as to whether an English society should have a German bookplate design. You can imagine why that would be the case. The first organized bookplate society is now accepted to be the English Society, which was founded in the spring of 1891. There were a lot of American members at the time. The Germans followed quickly within 3 or 4 months later. So at that time, societies began to exist. They began the publications of their own on a serious basis. The Exlibrist Journal, which lasts from roughly 1892, 1891 to 1908, is a standard reference source, then reprinted, usually available on the market from time to time, not inexpensive, but indispensable. A number of people began to produce major books. I mentioned Charles Dexter Allen on American bookplates. There's an equivalent volume on English bookplates, another one on French bookplates, and most expensive of all in the market is the book on ladies' bookplates. I saw one recently advertised at $1,000.
I'm sorry, book on what? Ladies?
Ladies' bookplate, that's the title.
Ladies?
Ladies, Ladies, ladies. Ladies books, which means if ladies had bookplates, ladies were book collectors. And they were serious book collectors and formed some outstanding collections and had some outstanding bookplate designs, which they had commissioned. In the United States, there was a society formed by 1894. In 1896, there was a small group of collectors in Washington, D.C., who formed a bookplate society called the Washington Exlibrist Society. They then decided to go national in membership, and they renamed themselves the American Bookplate Society. They increased the number of officers substantially. They did everything that they could plausibly do at the time to become a genuine, fully fledged National Bookplate Society. They published a little booklet called Exlibrist. There exist 2 versions, one on ordinary paper, one on vellum with numbered copies, 310 in all. There were 4 issues in total before it wound up. There just wasn't enough demand for a national society. That is an issue that we have had in this country for a long time. Russia has it, China has it, but solved it differently. Big countries, large geographic areas are hard to hold effective meetings in. People have to travel serious distances and absorb serious costs in order to attend an evening meeting like this. That's not common. California has its own proper place in this development. So that in the 1890s, early 20th century, a young man named Sheldon Cheney, Cheney, founded the California Bookplate Society. And he launched a quarterly journal called California Bookplates in November of 1906. He was the editor and he published all of this at his own expense. Then he renamed it the Bookplate Booklet, and it continued as a publication of his until 1911. But the society lived on for another 4 decades, and it wound up in Palo Alto in September of 1950. So California has a deserved, prominent place in the development of bookplate collecting in this country. And I would give it the edge in competition with the East Coast in this respect. But back east, the American Bookplate Society was again reestablished in 1913. It had 18 members, mostly in New York City, but it had a member in Kansas City, Missouri. And that was a man named Harry Alfred Fowler, who died in 1959. He was an enthusiastic and I would say even courageous bookplate publisher and collector. He floated a trial balloon in 1911 by publishing something called the Bookplate Booklet. And then he raised the issue in his journal of creating a national bookplate society. And in that pursuit, he launched the next year a publication called the Exlibrist in a larger format. And then he changed it again and called it Biblio, and once again sought further financial and membership support. This was a transitional undertaking, and then he launched yet another one called Bookplate in 1914, and that he worked in collaboration with a man named Nicholas Carver, who was at Princeton on the East Coast. Then he changed yet again. This man was infinitely inventive and produced a publication called the Miscellany from 1914 to 1916. And then he published a yearbook, hardcover, 5 or 6 of them between 1915 and 1920. So all of these are publications that are not easy to find, but findable, and they're essential reference material on American bookplates. It's not easy to know in retrospect what drove Fowler in his various publication ventures. He kept at it between 1917 and 1921. He published the Bookplate Booklet, new series. Then he published something called the Bookplate Bulletin in 1919, superseded the next year by the Bookplate Chronicle, which lasted for 5 years, from 1920 to 1925. And then he published a very large format Bookplate Annual, which he issued together with his various other publications. He was then overtaken by 1922, the society that James Keenan is now the director of. So this is the American Society of Bookplate Designers, Collectors and Designers. It has had, if I remember correctly, only 4 leaders since its inception in a full century. So this began with one of these, and then 3 other people have served. Carlisle Bear, Audrey Aralanis in California, and now James Keenan, also in California. There was another society formed in this state. That was called Bookplate International. That was the name of its exhibitions. The full name of the society was the Bookplate Association International. It was formed in 1925. It organized the first juried international exhibitions of bookplates from all over the world. And I learned about it in Moscow. I was shown catalogs, little tiny thin lists of artists who participated in the annual exhibitions by a Russian collector who had inherited his collection from his father and who knew that the Russians had been participating in these exhibitions. There were no illustrations, but their names appeared. And the interesting part and sad part was that many of the names had been repressed. They had been executed in the late 1930s. There were Russians, there were Ukrainians, there were Baltic artists, Sometimes there was a little confusion as to where they were actually from. That was confusion by the organizers, no doubt, who probably found book plates arriving by mail, which had been sent from countries in which they did not originate. And so they were confused about who they were. But they were distinguished artists, and some of them won prizes. So I founded a journal that lasted for 10.5 years called Bookplate International. And I chose the name because of the California Society that it existed. It existed until 1937, and then it was formally wound up, and two of the leading figures that were involved in it had passed away. One was Helen Wheeler Bassett, who died in 1935, and the other was Dr. Ora Eugene Moneta, who passed away in 1936. I was able to find at the Los Angeles County Museum the preserved entire exhibition. They have it in drawers, and they have all of the original plates that were on show at that particular time. That came as a surprise to Russian colleagues who were unaware that the plate still survived in coherent form. But this, as far as I know, it's still there. I looked at it quite some years ago. So meanwhile, in June 1922, overlapping Fowler's ventures in Kansas City and overlapping the Bookplate Association International here in California, 26 bookplate collectors and designers founded the society that James now heads. These included Carlisle Baer, B-A-E-R, who was the president for a long time and gave his collection to the Library of Congress, where it now is. Bookplate designers like Elisha Brown Bird, Sarah Hill, and the Reverend Arthur Knoll. Knoll was the first president. He lasted for 1 year and asked to be relieved, and he was succeeded by Baer. And then after Baer passed away, Audrey Arelanis took over, and she's been succeeded by James. So they had 51 members to start. By 1972, on their 50th anniversary, they had about 100, of which 42 were institutions. Over the next half century, membership floated between 150 and 200, and I think it's probably been very stable ever since, but not grown significantly beyond that. So in a large country where meetings are geographically almost unrealizable, these meetings are infrequent at best. That means that a society like this is held together by its publications. Baer understood that very well, and he took responsibility for editing a very superior yearbook, handsomely designed, well printed, from 1922 to 1969, and then that was duly continued by Arelanis and Keenan. Arelanis was fascinated by the literature on bookplates, and she created a newsletter, quarterly newsletter for members, which amongst other things documented new bookplates, of course, but documented the literature on bookplates, writings about bookplates anywhere in the English-speaking world. And she collected all of that material together, and in 1971, she published in Detroit the indispensable bibliography of Anglo-American bookplate literature. That is a book that any collector will want to have available for research purposes. So the other society that is not only open, all societies are open to foreigners, but the other society that is open linguistically to us is the Bookplate Society in England, which regards itself as the legitimate successor of the original Bookplate Exlibrist Society of 1891. It publishes a journal that appears twice a year and a quarterly newsletter and a book, so that if you are a member, you qualify, like the Private Libraries Association, you qualify to receive a book as part of your membership dues. Books have become so expensive to print that, of course, now these days that good book, good solid work will probably be credited 2 or 3 years of membership. But nonetheless, it's an important domain of bookplate scholarship. And there we are. FISAI, I mentioned to you at the beginning. FISAI was established informally in the late 1940s in Europe, but American collectors took part in it. Just informal gatherings, half dozen people getting together at an agreed time, exchanging bookplates, exchanging gossip about bookplate designers, anything that's of relevant interest to them. And they did that mostly year by year and just by agreement through correspondence, et cetera. FISI had no publications at the time. In 1966, they decided to become a bit more formal, and so they created this as a proper unincorporated association would be, I think, our characterization of it. And it has continued to exist with congresses every 2 years in various points. Various countries invite them to take part. I served as the first executive secretary for 30 years, from 1986 to 2016. And so of the 3 congresses that have happened since 2016, using a baseball analogy as the pitcher, I'm responsible for those being on base. And now that period has ended, and I agree, I'm no longer responsible for any runs that may be scored after that. How do you get a book plate? Most collectors at some point in their collecting activity want to have a provenance mark that they can paste into their book, usually, and they ask themselves, how do I find somebody to design it? What conditions could I expect to encounter if I approach somebody to do it? How do I choose what I want, etc. There are certain canons that we in FISI have come to regard as more or less standard in this activity. So I guess the first advice I would give to you is look at other people's book plates. Look at other books about book plates that have illustrations and see what you like. Look for inspiration, look for ideas. Everybody's book plate is their own creation ultimately. It's their decision what to choose. Design it yourself if you have the skill. People do that. There's no reason you should have only one. Have as many as you want. Depends what you collect, what kind of books you're going to put them in, etc. Your taste and fashions will mature over time. What you thought you liked when you started collecting, you may not like as much later on and as an experienced collector. So you change. One advice I would give is don't underprint what you think you're going to need. People tend to adjust the print run to how many books they have in their collection at the time and not allow for expansion and growth, which can be a mistake. It's not so easy. The printer you used is retired, or you can't get paper anymore like you had the first time around. There are all kinds of impediments that can come up that you don't expect at the time. So the question always is, what is it that you want to depict on your book plate? Maybe you just want a calligraphic label or a typographic label. Some people prefer that. Do you want a pictorial design? Do you want, what should be depicted on the book plate, if at all? And who could undertake the design? And whoever does undertake the design, who's capable of printing the design? The designer himself or herself? Or do you have to go to a third party in order to get it properly printed? Beautiful design, badly printed is rubbish, just as a bad design is rubbish. So you have to take into account the whole process and ensure that quality is followed. FISI has adopted a standard set of symbols that all collectors used to indicate on the back of their book plates in pencil what technique the designer used, whoever the designer was. And that design list has expanded with the development of computers in recent years. So now we have CAD, computer applied design. We have CGD, computer generated design. We have CRD, computer reproduced design. And a lot of collectors of my generation won't touch any of them because they're not human products. I'm not so sure we're right about that, but be that as it may. Be that as it may. Some people have a mature idea about what they have in mind. Others will seek inspiration from other sources. As I suggested, take a look at bookplate books to get some ideas, if that's what you want. People who design their own usually do it by pen and ink drawing, which means it's going to have to be reduced and then photographically printed. Cliches, they're known as in our circles. Others are capable of carving on wood or on engraving on copper or even steel and producing a very capable design of their own. Steel and copper, however, have more limited printing possibilities. There's a limitation on how many quality prints you can get. So we have to take that into account as well in choosing the medium that you prefer. There is the so-called universal bookplate, the kind that you buy in stationery stores. Nice design from the books of, and you fill in the name, however you choose to do it. Type it, write it yourself, whatever. Those are generally not collected seriously by bookplate people because essentially they're reproductions of other people's designs and just added in. But they're good for children, and some people do prefer them. So they're commercial art. They have their own place in the world of bookplates, but probably not, as a rule, generally collected. One exception to that is the Antioch Bookplate Company, which was based in Ohio. And James has just published a book, his connection with this Congress, on the gentleman, Mr. Morgan, who founded that company with respect to bookplates. And it's a very interesting little booklet that he's put together for this purpose. So if you go on eBay, you will find Antioch bookplates being offered. They could be bought at the time, little packs of 50, very inexpensive. Rockwell Kent was one of the artists whose works were used for Antioch purposes, and so was Lynn Ward. Those designs are in some demand, but they're inexpensive. If you choose a designer, when you choose a designer, I guess I would put it that strongly, then you want to discuss in detail with that individual all aspects of the design, the size of the bookplate, the size of the printing, the paper, what it actually is that you want in the design. You want the right to inspect and approve the ultimate design. I would say if you can negotiate it, ask the designer to supply you with all preliminary sketches and all other preliminary workings of the design, including preliminary proofs, so that you have the full dossier, so to speak, of your bookplate. Well, the designer may prefer to keep that for himself or herself, and that becomes a matter of negotiation and probably price. But one way or another, it's part of bookplate history, and it's part of the history of the design that's most people will have no knowledge of outside, and even you and your designer may forget as time passes. It's useful and interesting material, and it's interesting to see how a design actually matures in the designer's mind for this purpose. Copyright. Copyright depends what country you're dealing with. In many countries, but not all, copyright will vest with the designer, and that will include the preparatory materials. If it's important to you, you may want copyright to be transferred to you with the design. And in that case, you might well pay extra for that to happen. Some artists will have strong views about this, and they may or may not be willing to surrender it. But then that leaves the issue of reproduction of the design. Can bookplate journals, just for informational purposes, announce the appearance of your bookplate by reproducing a copy of it for this purpose? I would negotiate that with the designer. It's in the designer's interest that you do so as a rule. But sometimes people don't want their bookplate design to be known elsewhere. I wrote a book years ago on Sherlockian bookplates, and I approached a leading Sherlockian collector for advice on illustrations, and he sent me 30 different plates from his own collection to use for illustrated purposes. And I used them. And the book appeared. And I got a letter about a year later from a lady in Tennessee who said that her bookplate design appeared in my book, and she had an agreement with the owner of the bookplate that there would never be any reproductions of that bookplate under any circumstances whatsoever. She said that she had prepared the design, the drawing, as a book illustration, and he had begged her to allow him to use it for his bookplate as well. She consented to that on that condition. So I wrote back and said, but how would you expect me to know that? Because you said there's nothing indicated on the bookplate that that agreement was reached. And the gentleman who sent me the bookplate said nothing. So either he forgot, or he didn't know, or there was no such agreement, whatever the case is. We left it at that. But if that's important to you, take the necessary steps to be clear with the designer what's to be happened with it. That may affect the designer's ability to exhibit the bookplate design. to illustrate it himself or herself, the fate of the designer's archive later in life, etc. These are not factors to be ignored if they're important to you. For most people, they aren't, but for some people, they are. The designer is likely to want to keep a certain number of prints of your bookplate for his or her own personal artistic archive. And that's entirely fair game. It's just a question of how many and what they may do with the prints. Can they sell them individually? Can they exhibit them in their personal exhibitions of art? That's a matter to be decided, but the ordinary rule would be yes, they can, unless you have reason to restrict them in doing so. There are certain canons that we apply, and they're not entirely followed in this exhibition, about lettering on bookplates. This is the most challenging part of bookplate design for nearly all designers. There are a few engravers in the 20th century who achieved personal distinction for the ability to engrave letters. Eric Gill, Edward Johnstone, Reynolds Stone, Leo Wyatt, Michael Renton are just some names that come to mind. That's all part of the English school where they taught lettering as much as they taught anything else. And they taught it as part of engraving and not just as part of calligraphy. Years ago, I commissioned Michael McCurdy, who will be well known to all of you, a wonderful wood engraver in Massachusetts. I was visiting professor at Harvard Law School in the spring of '87. And so I made it my business to commission a bookplate that would depict the law school. And I traveled out to his place and he agreed to accept the commission. And then he said to me, but I don't want to do the lettering. He said, I really don't letter well. Just let me do the pictorial element and use type something else for the lettering. Well, I was younger and stupider then than I am now. And so I said, no, I insist on the lettering. So he produced a really excellent image of the law school. The lettering was awful, just awful. He was right in what he was asking me. So when I had to have the bookplate printed, and I had it printed by an English printer, I said, look, I need to substitute his lettering with typeface. And the printer said, not a problem. And it wasn't. And so I have a properly lettered plate, but I have some proofs with some of the most childish lettering you can imagine. Well, that just means each designer will have or not have ability with lettering, and you want to take that into account in what, because bad lettering and a good design produces a bad bookplate. You need both to be of equal quality. There are other canons that we recommend strongly. If you want to use the word exlibrist, then we debate, is it two words or one? Both capitalized, neither capitalized, hyphenated? All are legitimate, just depends what you do. In some languages, not English, have rules about this that we don't have. But we don't approve in our circles of the initials EL or EXL. It has to be the full words. Latin knows no abbreviations of those words. It can be in English from the library of, it can be from the collection of, his book, her book, their book. If it's plural, if it's a bookplate for two people or more, there are analogous formulas. But you want it to be literate. You want it to be proper grammar. Modern bookplates often vary enormously in size. So you've already seen that here in the exhibition. There are big books and there are small books. So you may have a bookplate design done for a miniature book, for miniature book collectors. It's going to be a tiny, tiny, tiny exlibrist. There are races on between designers as to who can produce the tiniest exlibrist of all. And there are some sterling examples out there that you need serious magnifying glasses to be able to see what the designer has produced. There are extremely large bookplates. And if you have a collection of Audubon, then you need a large bookplate. That's a very substantial elephant folio set of books. And there are books larger than that. So bookplate size can vary legitimately with the wishes of the commissioner and the wishes of the designer. But to the extent that book plates are collected as graphic art in their own right and are not commissioned for the purpose of ever appearing inside a book, but are commissioned for the purpose of exchange, for example, or exhibition, then size can take on quite a different meaning. And there are elements of criticism that are leveled against the size of book plates, which are believed to have been done not for bookplate purposes. That too is a continuing debate. Yeah, I think it will probably never be resolved. So the short way of saying it is bookplates come in all sizes and shapes, as do the books themselves, from elephant folios to miniatures. Coffee table books can take a very large bookplate, for example, and it seems entirely appropriate. So it's really a matter of your judgment and your own taste as to what you prefer in this collection. There's always the question of how much you pay a designer for a bookplate design. And that's going to depend on the medium, on how many you want to be printed off, if it's copper or etching, etc. The maximum print run is probably going to be 100. The artist is going to want to keep some for his personal archive. So you're going to be into, I won't quote figures here because that's going to vary from one designer to another. But I would guess that at a minimum with the most simple techniques, you're looking at probably $90 upward for a Zinco produced bookplate design. One Italian collector, I put to you the question of should you have more than one bookplate? One Italian collector commissioned more than 2,500 personal plates, some of which he actually gave to the American Society, to James's Society. Computer design bookplate should cost less. Any form of graphic technique that involves reproduction elements that are not by hand are likely to be less expensive than those that do. Nobody knows how many bookplate collectors there are in the world. We know that FISI has roughly 45 active society members. FISI is composed only of societies, not of individuals. And there will be a handful of societies that are not part of us. How many members they have doesn't exhaust the potential number of bookplate collectors for two reasons. A lot of people join more than one society because they want the publications. And secondly, a lot of people don't join any society. And so we don't know who they are, what they're doing out there. But if I said 5,000 to 10,000 in the world, my guess is that that may be a reasonable guess, but it's no more than that at the time. When I started collecting bookplates, that was in 1976. It all started because I wanted my own bookplate for my own library. And since I have a library that dealt with Soviet law and Russian law, I wanted a design, if I could get it, by a Russian wood engraver. And in due course, I found one. And when I commissioned the bookplate, I learned that other people collect bookplates. I didn't know that. I didn't know there were books on bookplates. Try going into your local antiquarian bookseller and ask him if he's got any books on bookplates. You'd be lucky to find one. The literature on bookplates, and I'm talking books now, not articles, is in excess of 60,000. There's a lot of books out there, but they're low print run. They're not so easy to sell. They turn up in dealers, and they usually don't hang around very much. So the other ways to get them are through auction or by exchange with others at congresses like this. Whatever other informal ways you can find to locate the existence of bookplate literature and acquire it. But bookplates are not like stamps. They're not industrial products. They're not produced by states and governments for fixed prices. Philately has its own adherents and its own principles. Bookplate collecting, you're dealing with, we don't know how many bookplates in history, millions of bookplates have been done. And probably the great majority are unknown to collectors. This is what bedevils provenance studies, because they end up with books with bookplates in them, and there's no trace of them. in the literature, or there is a trace, but you really have to know the literature in order to find it. You have to do some serious research. The chances that any bookplate collector with any serious intent at all will genuinely make a discovery about the design of a bookplate are about 100%. It will happen. And the good part is that we hope you write it up when it does happen. You will find bookplates that are unknown. You will identify designers of bookplates that are known, but the designer has not been, etc. This summer, a bookplate copper engraving, the plate itself, not the bookplate produced from it, went up at auction, and it is the printing plate used for the Arthur Conan Doyle bookplate. Now the question is, did Arthur Conan Doyle have a bookplate, or did he have this bookplate or not? The bookplate began to appear in the mid-1950s in bookseller catalogs, in books, laid in but not pasted in. Look legitimate, nice, beautiful armorial plate. Engraver's initials, but engraver unknown. I wrote in my Sherlockian bookplates about the existence of this bookplate because I had studied Russian law at Harvard Law School under Professor Harold Berman. And Harold Berman was the lawyers for the Conan Doyle estate when they sued in the Soviet Union for royalties on the millions of copies of Sherlock Holmes stories that the Soviets had published and paid no royalty on. Well, they weren't parties to the Copyright Convention, so they didn't have to pay royalties. But the Conan Doyle people felt they should pay royalties. And so a suit was brought in a Soviet court for this purpose. And Berman was chosen to represent the estate. Well, he said, I was asked by a colleague in the law school how it went. And I told him that there were two issues. One was whether I could appear on behalf of the Conan Doyle estate. And the other was whether they were entitled to royalties. He said, I won in the first and I lost in the second. Well, said the professor, what did you argue on the second? And he said, I argued unjust enrichment, which is a principle of American law as well, of course, and it was a principle of Soviet law. And the professor who put the question to Berman, who was a specialist in tort law, said, you should have lost on that one. And so he did. But that was just an aside at the time to indicate that there was interest in Conan Doyle material. And the existence of this bookplate, which appeared in the market suddenly inside books, which allegedly came from the Conan Doyle library, was either suspicious or fortuitous, as the case may be. Well, it soon transpired that we knew at least part of the story. We didn't know who designed the bookplate, but we knew that Conan Doyle's son, Adrian, was selling the books off from his father's library, that he had commissioned the bookplate from somebody, and that he was laying the bookplates in, and they were being cataloged as such. Well, it didn't take long for the book dealers to catch up with what the truth was. They couldn't advertise the books anymore as having been Conan Doyle's. And that's been largely the case. But then this summer, this bookplate, copper engraving plate itself from which the bookplate was printed appeared. The story of the auctioneers was that it had been found in the refurbishment of a house in Brighton on the English seacoast. We still don't know who did it. I don't know who bought it. I did not go for it myself, but it adds to the mystery. And so maybe we'll find out now who the initials belong to on the plate. Whoever it was a very gifted copper engraver. It was very well done in all possible respects. So the possibility that you will make discoveries, as I suggested, is absolutely going to be certain if you're a serious collector at all. And the way you're going to determine whether you've successfully found something that nobody else has seen is by canvassing the literature to see if anybody else has done something on it. Joining a bookplate society. For goodness sake, you ought to be members of the American Society. And I would say it's well worth your while to join the Bookplate Society in England as well. Partly for the publications, but two societies have auctions of bookplates regularly. The society in England does, and the Swedish society does. So each quarter or each month, as the case may be, If you're a member of the society, you have access to the auctions. Excellent material is auctioned. The price level is different on the whole from eBay. It's lower. It's sort of in the crowd pricing rather than dealer pricing of book plates. Dealers, of course, can have book plates, and sometimes they massively overestimate what they're worth, and sometimes they massively underestimate what they're worth. There are lots of stories about all of this once you join bookplate circles and become part of the gossip or information network. If you're interested in a third society, I would look at the German society, even though you may not speak German. They do enough in English so that it's useful to what you're about. So that brings me to my concluding section, some comments briefly on the literature of bookplate collecting. And my message so far has been amass as much as you can. There are things now that are online that didn't used to be. The American Society has key reference works available to their membership online, maybe even to non-members. But you'll often want to prefer the book in the original version of it, just for effectiveness of use. The high points of American bookplate collecting are well illustrated in my own book on American bookplates, which appeared for the Boston Congress in the year 2000. There are 100 bookplates illustrated, all by different designers. It gives you a good survey introduction to what other people have either designed themselves or commissioned. And the most outstanding, I think, at least in my view, bookplate designers are included in that volume up to the time of publication. There are a couple of publications that have just come to an end, but one I'll mention to you. This was a Portuguese gentleman named Arthur Mota Miranda, who was a collector in Portugal. He retired and decided to publish initially with Fisai volumes on contemporary exlibris. And he did 7 of them, one for each Congress. They're very difficult to get, especially the first 2 volumes. They contain a lot of tipped in original book plates. They will bring, if you find them complete, a very significant price, as they should, on the market. He had to stop because in 1984, we had the Congress in East Germany, and the East Germans wanted no part of this. It was a currency issue. This was not a censorship issue. This was a question of how would they pay for it. And of course, they had a non-convertible currency and it just couldn't get off the ground. So Mota Miranda decided to shift to something else. He shifted to an encyclopedia of exlibris design. And he produced 30 volumes with tipped in examples from the artist concerned. He always worked in conjunction with the designers. Full checklists as of the date of publication were included for each artist. Then he decided after 30 volumes, it was time to retire. And he didn't like retirement. So a couple of years later, he started it again. And this time he did 25 volumes, or maybe 24. We're not sure about the 25th because he died while it was in press. And neither Andrew Peake, who's indexed all the sets concerned, nor I have ever seen the 25th, although I wrote an introduction for it at the time. If you can find any of those or a complete set, then it's well worth having. Well, that brings me to the end of my remarks. I'm happy to take any questions that anybody may have, either on Zoom through chat or from the audience, as you may prefer. Thank you very much.
We can start with any questions here in the audience. Does anybody have a question? Paul.
I have a lot of questions. I'll start with one. Is there a difference between collectors collecting a typographic book plate and grade book plate? It's a hierarchy.
There's no hierarchy. Some people prefer one, some people prefer both mostly, and some people prefer the other. But no hierarchy and no sense of hierarchy either, not from the collector's point of view, but from the substance of the book plate or book label itself. If it's typographic, it's probably a book label more than the other, but it depends. It's what the designer's actually done. Some of the earliest provenance marks we have are book labels typographic.
Another question from the audience. So we have a couple of questions on Zoom. So while you think of some questions, I'm going to go to the Zoom audience and ask a question or two. So there's a question here that says, does adding a new book plate to an old book affect its collectible value?
In my opinion, not. But there's a larger question implicit in that one, and that's whether does adding any book plate to a book decrease or enhance its value. And there are book dealers, in my experience, differ on this. Some say it makes no difference. Some say it worsens, and some say it may even enhance the value. So you will see in catalogs, usually the views of the book dealer concerned, say book plate. You should identify that the book plate exists in the book, whether he's knowledgeable enough to indicate whose book plate it is or who designed it. Because if it's an Eric Gill book plate, that would say that would add value to the book, no matter whose it was. We discover book plates in the book plate world because dealers draw attention to them. They're the first line of contact with new book plates.
Back to the audience. Question? Paul, go ahead.
So, a technical question about book plates. How do you adhere them to the book? What kind of paste do you use? Do you use a gummed paper, which would personally be my preference, just for neatness and easiness? But I am not a book plate collector, so I.
There are two ways to respond to the issue. One is what did people use in the past, and the other is what should you use today if you're going to affix a book plate. I share your view that gummed book plates are the easiest to work with, and if you worked with your printer, you should be able to find paper where the gummed part is consistent with archival standards. But in the past, that didn't always happen.
Right.
And there are times when the book plate is worth more than the book. So one example that I can give you was the library of Dennis Wheatley, the novelist, which is now going up in price. But Blackwell's acquired most of his books. And the lesser books they dumped out on the sidewalk at 50 pence a piece. And one of my colleagues got up there, happened to open one and found a beautiful engraved book plate for Dennis Wheatley by Frank Poppe, 1926. We'd never known that he had this book plate. And it was a wonderful example. So our colleague bought up 10 copies of books with the book plate in it and passed them around. Then we faced the question of how to get the book plate off the book because we wanted the book plate. The book was of no interest whatsoever to us. So I used wallpaper remover. Others tried to soak it in water, but whatever glue they'd used was water resistant. It didn't work. So that's an issue. I think we would say today, if it's not gummed paper and it's contemporary book plate that you're going to lay in, use an archivally approved flour paste, which is readily soluble. And it's touchy, but effective.
Over here.
Does the book plate value can it vary based on maybe the drama and the artist? You mentioned the Arthur Conan Doyle story where his son was pasting his plate in to make kind of fake the ownership of the book. Isn't that in itself make that little drama like that?
Didn't catch the last, is itself not?
Does that in itself, that drama add to the value of the book or the plate? I think that's the
Yeah,
question.
that's right.
It might if you know the story, but most collectors aren't going to know the backstory to that particular incident. I'll tell you that I verified the story with Conan Doyle's daughter, who was based in London and who I had the opportunity to meet and to ask the question. And she confirmed that her son Adrian had commissioned the book plate, but she did not know from whom, and that he had laid it into the book. But I want to be clear, it was never in any example known to me, it was not pasted into the book. It was just laid in to the inside the cover. He didn't paste it.
Speaking of it being laid inside the cover, is there a one proper place that a book plate should be attached to the book?
It depends on the book, I suppose. The place most commonly encountered is on the inside cover, but you occasionally find them on the flyleaf. And if there's more than one book plate, you may find them in both places. And you can even find them, I've seen them at the end of books. And I've seen book plates printed from the plate into the book itself. Those are early books, but they must have done it before they bound it. Otherwise, it was a very tricky operation.
Another question here in the audience? We have one more question which we can take from Zoom, and it's this participant says they have books with one or more book plates of former owners, and they added their own book plate, but should they remove the others that are in there when they do that?
It's a question of taste. My own reaction would be no, that the sequence of provenance evidence is of interest in and of itself, tells you where the book has been. I would encourage you in that case to keep it.
Great. All right, last call for questions here in the audience. We'll wrap up. No other questions. Great. So big round of applause for our speaker here tonight.
Just a final remark. I said I'd worked on this from a manuscript tonight. The Grow Your Club is publishing a book shortly. It's in press. The talk that I gave tonight is based on the contribution that I made to that book. I think it's going to be 350 copies. I know there are probably some Grow Your people in the room, but my impression is that it will also be available to outside members.
Well, I can find out information on that, and I can send that out to especially the folks who are joining us on Zoom if they're interested in following up on that. So again, thank you again to our speaker. And thank you everyone for attending this Book Club of California program this evening. Our next program is a hybrid. Our next program is a hybrid presentation with in-person and Zoom component. That's going to be next Monday, September 19th. It's titled Outlaw Printing: How Discontents, Troublemakers, Organizers, and Visionaries Published for Social Change. And our speaker is archivist and author Lincoln Cushing. This talk next week is going to be co-presented and co-hosted by the Northern California chapter of the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America. So you can register for that program either in person or online by going to our website at bcc.org/programs or signing up through the links in the emails that you might be getting from the Book Club of California. So again, thank you everyone for joining us. We look forward to seeing you in person or online at another book club program in the future. Have a great night. Stay healthy and be safe.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not sure I did.